Hi everyone. This video will review the requirements for the case study assignment for the course Career and Employment Resources. The instruction package you see on the screen can be downloaded from Blackboard, and you may want to have it handy as you watch this video so that you can make notes about any important points you want to highlight. This assignment is worth 30% of your final grade and is due midnight Sunday at the end of week 5. In this assignment, you're going to be reviewing 3 short case studies. You're going to read all 3 case studies and respond to the same 3 questions for each one. Each case study is worth 9%. So times 3 case studies, that adds up to 27%. And then 3 additional marks are awarded for things like quality of written work, including spelling and grammar, expression of ideas, giving proper citations, and meeting the word count requirement. One thing you will need to be doing as you're doing this assignment is to look at the resource list that you have been compiling in the course so far to respond to some of the questions. Each week so far in the course, I have been encouraging you to create a list divided into the 3 different categories: who am I, what's out there, and how do I get there, from Frank Parsons' model. And then to organize the resources on your list within each of those categories so that you have a sense of, if I have a client who's in the Who Am I stage, these are, for example, some resources that would be appropriate, and also for the other stages. So do ensure that you have your list compiled. If you haven't put it together, you really do need to do that, especially as you get closer to the end of the course. And this is one situation here where you're doing this assignment that you're going to need to consult that list when you start to work on the case studies. Your responses to the questions for each case study should be about 300 words for each one. So if you're doing one case study and there are 3 questions, that means that each question's response might add up to about 100 words. There might be a few more in one question and a few less in another, but in total for each case, about 300 words. So if you're doing 3 cases, that's about 900 words in total for all 3 case studies. So this is not a major essay that you're writing. When you are putting your responses together, please clearly number each case study. It's helpful if you do them in order rather than jumping around. So please clearly number each case study 1, 2, and 3, and then number your answers in responding to each question 1, 2, and 3, so that I know you have answered each question, all 3 questions for each case study. Use double spacing in your document, and please ensure that you save it as a Word file with your name in the title of the document when you save and submit it. Please do not submit the assignment through Blackboard. Just send it to me directly by email. And also, please do not password protect your file or save it as a PDF, because I can't open it then and insert comments and feedback on it. So that gives you an overview of what you're doing in the assignment. Here are the 3 case studies, and I'm not going to read through them in detail. You can take the time later to review them and really highlight and underline sort of key important points within each one. So those are the 3 case studies that you're going to actually be analyzing. And then let me show you the questions that you're going to respond to for each one. So as I said, there are 3 questions for each case study. And what I would like to ask you to do is to please answer all 3 questions separately for each case study. So do case study number 1, question 1, 2, and 3. Case study number 2, question 1, 2, and 3. Students sometimes blend all the answers together for, let's say, question 1 for all 3 cases. It can get quite jumbled up because you're talking about 3 different cases, 3 different stages, 3 different resources. It can really get quite confusing. So just make it really clear that you've identified each case, 1, 2, and 3, and that way you can also clearly see that you've answered all 3 questions for each case. For question number 1, based on the description of each case, you're going to identify what stage of the career life planning model each client is currently in. Who am I? What's out there? Or how do I get there? When you select the stage that you think the client is in, you're going to identify that, and then you're going to explain your choice by identifying at least 2 factors in each case study that lead you to identify the stage in each case. So as you're reviewing each case and you're analyzing it and you're deciding, I think this client is in the how do I get there stage, what are 2 points that are described in the case that led you to draw that conclusion. It's really important that you pick only one stage to analyze. Clients will only be in one stage at a time, and students sometimes will blend stages together and sometimes even try to make a case that the client is in all three stages. That just would not ever be the case. So really important that you pick only one stage to analyze. There are 3 marks in total for each case in responding to this question. So again, 3 marks assigned to each case for a total of 9 marks altogether in responding to this question. For each case, you get 1 mark for correctly identifying the client's current stage, and you get 2 marks for clearly identifying the 2 factors in the case that suggest what stage they're in. So again, 9 marks in total. You can see how they're broken down here. You get the full 9 marks if you clearly identify each client's stage and correctly identify each client's stage. And please remember when you're doing this to identify the stage by name. Sometimes students will say, well, I think the client's more near the beginning of the stages or more towards the end of the stages. State clearly if the client is in who am I, what's out there, or how do I get there. Make that really clear. And then highlight or describe the factors that you see in the case that identify, sorry for that little pop-up, that identify how you decided that the client was in that particular stage. So if you do all of that, you get the full 9 marks. Down at the bottom, if the stages are not clearly and correctly identified for each client, the factors are missing or are described in very general terms that really don't accurately reflect the selected stage, then there would be a deduction of marks for that. And then you can see the ranking of the marks in between those 2 points. Question number 2, now that you've identified the stage in question 1, what are 2 steps you would recommend that each client take? So we are talking in this course about what clients need to do in each one of these 3 stages. So you can go back and look at some of that information and decide, gee, if this client's in what's out there, what are 2 steps that the client might need to take, and explain why you think those steps would help them in their current stage. The steps that you select should be relevant and appropriate to the client's current stage. So really think about if they're in who am I, you wouldn't, for example, be recommending that they do a resume and a cover letter. Those are not appropriate steps. The client wouldn't be ready to do that because they're still trying to think through who they are, what they have to offer. They don't even necessarily have a clear target at that point. So do ensure that there's a match between the steps that you describe and the client stage, and that would help them just do the work required in this stage in order to move to the next stage. One little hint I want to give you is to ensure that you describe only the steps that are relevant to the current stage that you've identified for each client. You do not need to also describe what they would do in moving on to the next stage. So when you're working with clients in the field, it is really important that you focus and you help them to focus on what is it that they need to do right at this moment. So again, if they're in the who am I stage, out in the field, you wouldn't suddenly start working with them on a resume. That's not going to help them do the work that they need to do in the who am I stage. So again, 3 marks total for each case. You get 1.5 marks for identifying 2 steps and 1.5 marks for explaining how those steps would be useful for each client. So again, 9 marks in total across all 3 cases, 3 marks for each case. You can see that you get top marks if you describe 2 steps clearly for each client, and that those steps accurately reflect the work the client needs to do based on their current stage. And you give a good, clear explanation for why and how these steps would help the client do the necessary work in their current stage in order to move to the next stage. And then down at the bottom, marks are taken off if steps are not clearly identified for each client. Sometimes students will even duplicate and provide the same step twice and just put it in slightly different terms. So if you said I would help the client by working on them with their resume, that would be my first step. And then in the second step you said I would show the client different formats of resumes. Those steps are really the same. So make sure that they are two different steps, and if explanations are missing or described in terms that don't really demonstrate understanding of the appropriate steps to be taken in the client stage, that would result in some deduction of marks. And then the third question, this is where you're going to actually consult your list of resources that you've been compiling. In this question, you're going to, for each client, list 2 resources that you would recommend based on the stage you identified in question 1 and the steps you recommended that they take in question 2. The resources might include really anything that you've been exposed to in the program so far: websites, videos, printed publications, assessment tools, social media platforms, apps, all kinds of, pretty much anything that you think would be a valuable resource for the client. What you're going to do for this question is to identify really, that should say, 2 specific resources for each client, then explain fully how or why you think each one will help the client. So for example, if you think the client is in a stage where you might recommend they do some assessment tools to identify their strengths, personality, style, and values, what specific tools would you recommend? And do name them. So students may sometimes be very general and say, well, I'd have the client, go look at some social media platforms. Well, which social media platforms would you have them look at? Well, I'd have the client do an assessment tool. Okay, which tool would you have them do? So it's not enough to just say, very general. You need to give very specific titles, names, web addresses of the resources that you're recommending. Now, here's the part that's just a little bit tricky. You're identifying 2 resources that you're going to recommend for the client based on their stage. One of the resources can be taken from the list of the resources you've been given in this course. So that would come from the list that you have been compiling so far. If you say the client is in How Do I Get There, you can go back and look at the week where we covered the How Do I Get There stage and we talked about some resources, and you can pick one that you think would assist each client in each case. The second resource must be one that you have found on your own. It doesn't appear in any of the lists provided in the course. It's not something that you've been exposed to previously. So here you're going to just go and do a little bit of research and go and find something else. So if you're recommending assessment tools, for example, you've been exposed to a lot of assessment tools in the program, but there are certainly many, many more out there that are available. So you could go and find some other assessment tool that you haven't been exposed to in the program, and you could recommend that as the second resource for the client. Another thing that's tricky is that you must provide different resources for each case. So for example, you can't recommend the same resource for more than one of the clients depicted in the cases. And since there are 3 case studies and you're recommending 2 resources for each one, this means you'll be identifying a total of 6 different resources for this assignment, 2 per client. So for the resources that you select, do ensure that you clearly identify how they would help the client with their specific needs, and that the resources match the stage you identified for each client in question 1. So for example, if you have a client in the Who Am I stage, as I've given this as an example already, you wouldn't recommend a resource on preparing a resume because they wouldn't be ready to undertake this task in stage 1. There are 3 marks given in total for each case. Again, a half a mark for each resource recommended. So 2 resources, that gives you 1 mark, and 1 mark for each explanation of why the selected resources would help the client. So 1 mark for each resource. So that adds up to a total of 3 for each case, and again, 9 marks in total for this question across all 3 cases. You get the full 9 marks if you identify 2 resources for each client that accurately fit with the client's current stage that you've identified in question 1. One thing that tends to happen sometimes here is that students don't refer back to questions 1 and 2 and just list a couple of resources that the client might find interesting. There has to be a clear match between the resources and the client stage. And then giving a full and clear explanation for why and how the recommended resources would help the client to do the necessary work in their current stage in order to move to the next stage. 2 different resources need to be described for each client, with 1 resource selected from those provided in the course and 1 found independently by the student. So a total of six different resources provided across all 3 cases. So if you do that, you get a total of 9 marks. Down here, there would be some deduction if resources are not clearly identified, if explanations are missing, or described in general terms that do not clearly demonstrate understanding of the appropriate steps. So again, there's kind of a mismatch between what you're saying and what the client really needs, or the resources are duplicated and repeated for more than one client. So those are the 3 questions that you're going to answer. Again, 9 marks for each one across all 3 cases. That adds up to 27%. And then you can see the 3 additional marks are given if the paper is free of spelling or grammatical errors and ideas are clearly expressed, that APA style is used to cite the resources, and the paper meets the word count requirement of approximately 900 words divided between 3 cases, approximately 300 words per case. I'm not counting them up. I'm not adding up every single individual word, but if your paper seems a little bit short, I might then do a word count. So a few words over or under is okay. So all of that, adding those 3 marks to the 27% adds up to 30%. And I think all of these points you have already seen. Just a reminder, please do not plagiarize. This is the time of the semester where students get tired and sometimes make mistakes. They might copy something they intend to put quotation marks around and then they forget. So just ensure that you are being mindful and watchful of avoiding plagiarism. Aim to divide your space in the paper evenly between the 3 case studies, as they're all worth the same number of marks. So if you've got, a page and 2 pages, let's say for case 1, 1 page for case 2, and only half a page for case 3, that really wouldn't be sufficient because obviously case 3 and case 2 might be a little bit too short. Do ensure that you respond to the questions listed for each case study. Be careful not to make any assumptions beyond what you read in the case study, and don't add extra information that does not appear there. Sometimes students in their analysis will invent something that's not really there and might say, well, this client is really struggling financially, or this client is a single parent and has, children, a family they have to support. If that information is not provided in the case, then please don't add it. And be specific and concrete when you're answering the questions. As I've said, just provide specifics about resources that you are recommending for the client. And I've already covered this. Please answer each question separately for each case. Do not give a single answer for question 1 that is meant to apply to all 3 cases. And I've talked about this already, ensuring the steps and resources are directly targeted to the client's needs, and you've got some examples there that explain that point. Ensure that your responses to each question discuss each specific client. Do not provide general commentary on what clients need to do in conducting a job search or making career choices, or what you would do in general with working with clients in the field. We want the responses here need to be addressed specifically to each client's individual stage and specific needs for steps and resources. And again, just make sure you spell check your work, and also just a reminder, please let me know if you need an extension. So that's it for this assignment. It's actually pretty straightforward. Watch your eyes as I scroll back up to the top. And again, if you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to let me know. And thanks very much for watching.